everyone else sees. I wonder if I can end chat. I usually do that. No, it's creepy.
No.
Yes. Let's disable all comments. Should turn that so no one can chat at all.
Okay. Should I move this? It's good there. Should I put it here?
That's almost better. I think that's better because yeah, then you get more of them and the screen at the same.
And he is going to send me the slide stack as we already did, but it's such a flurry of emails. So it's not.
Sorry, the slide.
You're fine.
So
I think, well, I can never tell. Like, I think this part has some.
it should be live. If anyone who follows the Brown Bag series, actually,
Well, and that's what.
oh yeah, I'm like, this is already.
It's playing on my title. Well, I used to be writing about him later. We see each other. Thank you. Turn down the lights.
Well, welcome everybody. It is noon, so we will get started. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Nathan Tai. Welcome to the July installment of our Brown Bag Lecture Series, sponsored by the History Department at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, as well as the Kearney Public Library. Lectures are held on the second Wednesday in selected months at the Kearney Public Library, and we have the full series on our website as well as on the library calendar. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank again the Kearney Public Library for their continued support of the Brown Bag series. We now offer them year-round, every month. We just have a wealth of knowledge in this community that we are very excited to share with everyone. We have upcoming talks in August 10th. Lena Homburger Cordia, who is a historian at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, will be giving her talk, Invisible Futbolteras, Gender, Nationalism, and Sport in Mexico and the World in the Early 1970s. And then our September talk is undetermined, but I will be giving it. Yeah, working on that one. Please stay in touch for a schedule of upcoming talks and other local history events, as well as highlights of our student and faculty research. Please look at the History Department social media page and website. We have a lot of students doing a lot of wonderful work across the state and across the nation, as well as very engaged faculty who are always doing something, as you're going to see evidence of today. Our topic today is vulnerable harvests, and our speaker is Dr. David Vail. Dr. Vail is Associate Professor of History here at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. He specializes in environmental and agricultural history, as well as the history of science and medicine and the Great Plains and public history. His research has appeared in numerous academic history, Endeavour, Great Quarterly, and Great Research. He is the author of 2 books, Chemical Pesticides, Aerial Spraying, and Health in North America's grasslands since 1945, and there are copies available here at the public library if you'd like to check one out. It's the best book on aerial spraying and crop dusting that you will read. And it was published by the University of Alabama Press in 2019, as well as the co-author, along with Deborah Reed, of Interpreting Environment at Museums and Historic Sites, published in 2019. In 2020, he was voted by the student body the best professor on campus. So he's not just a great researcher, he's also a great educator. His current monograph project, Vulnerable Harvests, Risk and Resiliency in the Cold War Great Plains, is under advanced contract from the University of Nebraska Press. Vail also serves on the board of directors for Humanities Nebraska and the board of governors for the Center for Great Plains Studies. In his spare time, David loves to mountain bike in the Great Plains and the Front Range and occasionally crash.
More than a kid.
Yeah, more than a kid. Please welcome me in joining Dr. David Vail.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Before I get started, I'm going to hand out and pass around, and I would like to have them back, but these volumes of the Yearbook of Agriculture. I know, I collect them, and Rosanna says that I need to use them more than have them set on my dusty bookshelf, and it's dusty too, so that it can be sort of used as an educational tool. So I promise I will talk more about them today, but I got excited to show and tell, and so here they are. They're only a selection. I couldn't bring all of them, or we would have multiple semi-trucks, no, not quite, to bring. But anyway, I want to say thank you to everyone for coming today. I appreciate you spending the next hour, or let's say less, with me. And I would love to hear your questions at the end. And also this is like a starting point of a conversation that I would like to have with you about my new research on the Cold War Great Plains, a region and an era that tends to get overlooked, at least by many historians. And so I'd like to begin to try to change that where I can. And I think today, my hope is that in this conversation that I'm starting today, that's not ending at the end of our talk, or my talk rather, that I would like to continue that conversation, because I think the insights of people in this region, but especially in this place, Kearney and Nebraska, have a lot to say and a lot to provide in terms of context from where I would like to go with this project. So before I get too far down the road here, I would also like to promote two events, one that has already transpired with Humanities Nebraska. I am one of the members of the board of directors, and talk about one of the most fundamentally important organizations in our state, but also does a lot for rural Nebraska and central Nebraska, especially here. We met here, I think, a recent board meeting, doing a lot of interesting work for environmental humanities. So the number one thing I want to say is Weathering Uncertainty took place a few weeks ago in Lincoln, but you can find it recorded here at humanitiesnebraska.org/weather. If you just Google Humanities Nebraska, you will be able to find this as well. But it had a variety of experts and people who live in our state talking about what is precarious about climate and weather and environment, and all in context of a production landscape, which is what Nebraska exclusively almost is, at least that feels that way, especially if I'm crashing headfirst into corn. Let's talk about that after this talk, on my mountain bike. But Weathering Uncertainty, I think, is a really powerful conversation that I would recommend everyone take a look at when you have extra time. Also, something that's upcoming at the end of July, and I probably personally won't be able to attend this, unfortunately, but July 28th through the 30th, they're doing a Chautauqua event in McCook, and it's all around the 1950s. And so it's nice to have these sorts of events across our state complement with some of the stuff I'm doing and others are doing around the Cold War, especially when we're thinking about rural America and the Great Plains in particular. So if you have some time, I highly encourage you to go and check that out in McCook. Then I'd like to take a moment up front here to say thank you to everyone involved with my current research. And it is very current, right? Again, this is a start of a conversation. This isn't a concluding sort of summary of things I've found. And so I wanted to say thank you first to the UNK Department of History, a huge supporter of what we do as teachers and what we do as scholars, and also what we do in the community. And so first, I want to say thank you to Dr. Tai and these Brown Bag Lecture Series. It's a great way to promote what we think is important, but also what the community can also think is important and have that dialogue. And so Dr. Tai, thank you very much for your ongoing efforts to plan these things. Also, I want to say thank you to the Department of History for supporting my research with the Gene Homaker Summer Research Fellowship. I could not do the research I'm sharing this afternoon with all of you without that support. And so I'm really grateful for a department that invests in us and believes in its faculty in the way that our department does. Also, I want to say thank you to Christy and Kearney Public Library. Talk about a really powerful relationship between UNK and the community. This is it. And so I want to say thank you very much for all the work that you do to get everything set up, to provide a venue for this to happen. Very important work, and so thank you. I also want to extend thanks to Truman and Eisenhower Presidential Libraries, which, by the way, it's not going to be quite like Dr. Vail's adventure tour in the Great Plains at Presidential Libraries, but it's going to kind of be that. Today, I really had to cut back on the slides of like what I did in archives and the documents I found. So I have a selection. It's not quite like I was sharing before many of you got here, like my grandparents used to have like those Kodak slides in the carousel, and we used to watch like 2 hours worth. And then somehow I got pegged as the guy who had to, as the grandson who had to like fix the slide carousel when it would get jammed between like slides 7 and 10, you know? So it's not going to be that, but it's going to kind of be that because I'm excited about traveling to Truman and Eisenhower this summer. And I would encourage everyone, if you can, to kind of take these sorts of civic adventures, you know, to go and check these places out, because you learn a lot more than you ever imagined, sometimes annoyingly so, but usually not. And you should check these out. And so a little bit of today will be what I found at Truman and what I found at Eisenhower. And again, historians typically, in terms of talking about environment and agriculture and agricultural science in the Cold War era, I mean, you may be surprised. I'm always kind of surprised that they sort of overlooked this region and that era, this sort of early Cold War era. And so I'm hoping to help address that by working on this project. But it's amazing to go to these places and kind of experience, to the extent that one can, that past and how it sort of shapes the present in many regards. And they both helped support that travel through research grants as well. So thank you to them. And then finally, and this list will continue to grow, no doubt, but these are all of the archival places that I've adventured to get some of this research to present to you today. And again, most of you in this room know this, but historians require primary sources as sort of the receipts, the evidence, to build what happened and how it happened and why we have to care about it. And I found some amazing stuff in these collections, but I promise you I will not spend hours talking about it. We can certainly, after our talk, do that, and I'm more than happy to overshare about those things. Okay, so we live in an important place, not just Kearney or Nebraska, but the region. It's important. And there's a sort of perspective about why it's important. And it's the production perspective is what I say. The agricultural production space, right? So corn, production landscape matters. And it matters in a multitude of ways. And it has, I mean, I'm focusing mainly on the 20th to 21st century, right? Because historians have to start and stop somewhere, or we'd be doing things forever. But in a lot of ways, the Great Plains and Nebraska in particular, right, it's important because of its production value, its production landscape. So you see things like this when you're traveling with a mountain bike in a state with no mountains, but you try to do your best because you love it so much, and you see this happening in harvest. So there's a sort of value of this place that's pinged, that's connected to production, right? So that's how some people in Nebraska and the Great Plains see this place, and fair enough. I also have to throw an ag plane in there. This is actually technically in Kansas, but agricultural aviation and pesticides and sort of chemical production piece to that becomes increasingly key in understanding the production history and the landscape of all of it on that sort of side, if you will. There's other ways to look at this place that's important, right? And that is through conservation, a lens of conservation, environment, the relationships we have with the non-human world. And all the ornithologists and those who just are birders, I always say, brag about where I live in Kearney, because we have this every spring. And so this matters, these relationships between the non-human world matters. And that also is a way to see our state. Bison also are one of my favorite mammals, so I threw that in there too. But very much key to that perspective of why this place matters. Also the sandhills, I haven't ridden my bike out there yet because ranchers, but and sand, but I want to. But this is very beautiful, right? And it defines sort of the place as well. And this is a beautiful shot that we got when Rosanna and I went to Kansas and did our Eisenhower adventure tour. We stayed in Manhattan, Kansas, where Kansas State is. And this is Konza Prairie. Just on the side of the road, we took this. I took this with my smartphone, amazingly. And it's these moments that I remember when I would, that's where I got my Ph.D. at Kansas State, finished in 2012. And so I've been in the Great Plains a long time, and this is one of these iconic moments that you see, and we can have a million of them in Nebraska as well. But this sort of beauty is another way to see why this place is important. And the Konza Prairie, by the way, is another really good example of production folks and conservation folks working together to preserve one of the last spots of tallgrass prairie in the world. There's also the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve that's further south in Kansas, also part of that last sort of global system of natural prairie. So all this to say, you can look at it at the production perspective, you can look at it in the conservation perspective. I would argue that those things are intertwined, and that's what we're going to see next here with my project. That it's not enough to just see it as a production place or a conservation place, but rather that it's intertwined. And what happens when those things conflict? Because they do. And all of us who've lived here longer than a day know that they do. And so here's one of my favorite parks in the Great Plains, and I mean that. I say favorite because there are two ones that are better, Cotton Mill and Wilson Lake, which is in Kansas, and the reason they are superior to Yanny is because mountain biking trails. That's the only reason. But I love Yanny, and I love it for a lot of different reasons. But we all remember this, sort of the flood that occurred. And this is just one of the many ways in which disasters and natural conflicts play a role in this sort of the middle ground, if you will, between the production side and the conservation side. And a lot of times I would argue, and I do argue in my work, that those sort of conflicts often emerge as natural disasters, but not exclusively. So what happens when these things collide? The top photo here is from a smaller town south of us in 1930s Dust Bowl era. The bottom photo is Nebraska DOT shot in York on I-80 on March 12, 2022. Both of them had ominous dust storms. And so, again, in my opinion, and what I can sort of see these historical relationships playing out, there's sort of a long-term middle ground of these conflicts, right? What happens when the production side conflicts with the conservation side, the non-human side, right? What happens when we ignore the conservation side for the production side, right? There are consequences, historic and real world. And so my book, I hope, begins to try to address this and how things changed over time in terms of the Great Plains, but also in terms of the region's shaping of federal policy going forward after World War II. So what happened when these relationships, production aims, and conservation views conflicted in the past, especially in the era that we're sort of talking about this afternoon? I would argue that these conflicts appeared, as they still do, as a series of disaster. And in my book, you have to choose, right? So like the most frequent for our region is drought, wind erosion, and floods. Of course, severe storms too, but the first three categories of disaster, if you want to categorize them like that, really come into play frequently and help drive change and views about environment that aren't just production centric, sometimes from producers themselves, right? And that's the interesting thing that I'm finding with this council that I'll be talking about in a second. That you have producers who also share and begin to grow in their view of conservation, not just for economic inputs or outputs, but something larger, something more meaningful. And I think that matters. And then finally, how can this past help? And this is what I hope my work does generally all of the time, but especially my hope is for how this book will be received in the end, that I hope that it can help, this past will help us address the intensity of these kind of conflicts, agricultural and environmental conflicts in our region going forward. How can they? Can they? I say they do. If our personal past shapes how we proceed day to day, right? So it matters that we know it, that we understand it, we try to, then maybe a larger significance of history also plays out in a similar way for a community, a society, a region. So here are some central themes that I came up with as I've been going along here. And by the way, the Great Plains that I'm going to be talking about largely is going to be around here. Right, and this is what the Center for Great Plains Studies designates as the Great Plains, although it's an ongoing, kind of annoying to me, argument about where the plains end and where the Midwest or the heartland begins. To me, my response is when we talk about dust storms or when we talk about noxious weeds, also my favorite sort of risk non-human entity, noxious weeds, they don't really have this argument. So why are we? But vulnerability environments is sort of the larger overarching idea. Historians have started to really talk about in environmental history sort of circles and agricultural history circles, talking about the role of vulnerability, this concept. And sometimes they're drawing from sort of social science too, which is helpful, but also limited. And so part of this is what risk is, and part of it is what resiliency is. And resiliency has been sort of a word that's been thrown around a lot recently, and I'm not going to use it in that context. What I'm talking about is risk generically for the work I'm doing. I'm defining it as the ability for hazards, natural or technological, human and or non-human, to threaten or damage. It's kind of a generic way of looking at it. But I think at least when you start a project like this, you want to have some sort of organizing principles that are flexible enough to allow for the evidence to guide where it needs to go, right? So risk in that context, sort of the theories that other historians and scholars have pursued right now is sort of, they look at the risk as sort of two ways, or sort of I don't know, like a first instance and a second instance. The first would be when the actual hazard occurs and what that all means and the consequences, human, non-human consequences. But then also a second sort of category when it leaves its cultural, social imprint upon people's recollection. And certainly I'm taking those sort of contexts up, the second idea about risk, when I read things like council members who are agricultural scientists throughout the plains, but they have a distinct memory of the Dust Bowl. In fact, the council, as I've learned and as we'll learn in a second, was formulated in sort of the 1930s in the Dust Bowl era by FDR to address some of these initial issues that were so deadly and destructive in the Great Plains. that left a cultural and social imprint on the scientists that would live on beyond the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and worry very much about what's going on in terms of floods or drought in 1952, in 1955, 56, 57. And those people include ultimately Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, because of where he grew up, which is Abilene, Kansas, which is where you can see his presidential library if you want to go on that adventure. Probably stay in, well, Abilene's fun to stay in for like one time, but then Manhattan is better, but maybe I'm biased. Keep that with us. I forgot that we're online now, so oops. Anyway, so that's how I sort of see risk, except I'm sort of adding a third category, which is how does this all play out in an agricultural production region, right? What does it mean to live in a place where production is sort of the main goal and certainly has a main sort of imprint on the place, but also how do people's views and recollections and memories shift that, and ultimately how does that play a role into things like science, a scientific approach to drought mitigation or a cultural view of policies, right? Not just for the region, but ultimately I see the council's role growing in federal emergency policies of drought relief, disaster relief, and so forth. Okay, so resiliency is another key theme in my book. And I sort of, again, generically defined it because you have to at some point, but adaptation to change to preserve and protect land, crops, and the environment. But really, for me, it's sort of all of that's talking about community. And that community isn't just human, but it's also non-human. And so stronger through community, sort of the resiliency piece. And interestingly, ecologist Otto Leopold's land ethic really came to mind to understand this. And I'll read a couple quotes to help us sort of cast this in the context that I'm sort of using it. But also, Leopold was cited by the council for all of these things when they're trying to figure out how to mitigate drought and what kind of policies. They're thinking in these terms too. So Otto Leopold, many of you probably know him, wrote a famous series of articles and studies around ecology and wildlife preservation and management. Ultimately, it's all sort of synthesized in a book, A Sand County Almanac, which I highly recommend you read. But the land ethic that Otto Leopold sort of came up with, he said, quote, "When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." And I think in a lot of ways that helps us get to a sense of community, this idea that our community isn't just inputs and outputs for land. It isn't just, and it wasn't, right? People had a view of this then as we sort of are still debating about this sort of stuff now. Right? But in the end, it's sort of, it matters, right? That you carry this view that is holistic and it's not myopic. But the fundamental of this land ethic is in the second quote, the more famous one, which he says, quote, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." And that concept is existing in this time and place that I'm talking about. And it is guiding participants in these councils and in their meetings, and in their discussions with USDA officials, and in their attempts to try to publish sort of more regional and local ideas about mitigating drought or addressing floods and all of that in these yearbooks that you see going around. And then there's a third category, region. Region matters a lot to me as a historian of the Great Plains. I mean, how could I argue otherwise? But also regional knowledge and regional views are diverse, but there are commonalities, and I think that matters. And so part of what I'm going to argue in my book is that the Great Plains is an important place to track these types of relationships, mainly between production, conservation, agricultural science, and disaster relief, and how those things play out within the region, and then also how they ultimately trickle up and out to federal policy and beyond. I have other central themes. I know that it's already almost 12:30, so I will continue to keep going. But agricultural health and environmental health, there's this moment in the early 1960s where those things start to diverge. And that matters because the folks who were on the agricultural health side woke up one morning and thought, oh, wait, I'm the enemy now, because there's a growing divergence between what health and preservation and conservation means in the early 1960s. And there's one book that sort of was a thunderstrike to this, and that's Rachel Carson's Silent Spring that was published in 1962. So that's also what I track in my first book, Chemical Land, sort of that moment and what that meant for ag pilots and sort of folks thinking that they are using, for good or for ill, using, because we have some really, in that book, there's some really weird like rogue pilots and chemical bootleggers, so you totally have to read that, at least that part. You can check it out downstairs after our talk if you want to. But there is this sort of moment where the idea of agricultural conservation and health changes from what an environmental ecological view of that is. And it changes across the country and will start to reverberate across the world, but it especially has consequence in our region. And so I want to explore that sort of divergence more in this book, because I think that's an important way to understand how things changed here, but also elsewhere. And then one of my favorite and unexpected connections, which always happens when you're in the archives, is the connection to all of this in civil defense. Typically with civil defense, what do we think about? What's that?
Air raids.
Air raids, shelters, right? And part of me is like, oh, I could totally do like an environmental history of like shelters and stuff, but then my first project is first, right? That's an inflection of a historian, by the way. So civil defense. So what about all the other stuff of civil defense, right? Not just the air raids or the atomic risk. That's there. This sort of age of peril is there, no doubt. But what about all the other stuff, like real disaster relief? Civil defense was part of that, at least in the Truman and Eisenhower administrations it was. And so sort of defining the other part of that history, I think really matters. And historians have really overlooked that piece of civil defense because they're always drawn to the material culture part of civil defense, which like I get, but I want to pursue that piece, the disaster relief piece, because there's a lot of similar conversations going on in civil defense stuff, not to mention like Val Peterson being a director of the federal civil defense from Nebraska, right, governor. So that there's a connection there as well. When I'm kind of talking about rescue science and emergency federalism, what happens when agricultural scientists are like trying to understand a disaster while they're also in a disaster, right? And that you see that play out in extension science, experiment station documentation. And what I'm kind of talking about emergency federalism, of course, we have the history of FEMA and all of that, but this sort of regional connective tissue piece has also been overlooked. So I'm sort of looking at this in this early era, Truman and Eisenhower in particular. And then finally, history of the Great Plains Agricultural Council. There's only one history that's been really written on this, and that was like a master's thesis in 1952 when the council was still sort of, some may argue, the most active, although they were active all the way through the 1990s, right? And so tracking this Great Plains Agricultural Council, how it shaped its own policy within the region, how that ultimately shaped federal policy and where that went in terms of concepts of food security and all of that. That's also what I'm excited to do. So yes, there's a lot involved. So really quickly, origins of the Great Plains Agricultural Council. FDR established a drought committee in the 1930s, really to talk about the future of the Great Plains region, but identified these concepts within the council, the committee rather, that ultimately in their report, they began this conversation that was both cultural and scientific at once, and as local as it could be, to identify uncertainty, risk, hazard, and the role of conservation in the Great Plains, mainly, right? And what's interesting in documents I see is that even with Truman and Eisenhower, it was sort of continue to expand their focus, but keep it on the Great Plains. Other regions of the United States are like, we have drought here too. It was really funny to see that, I'll say interesting to see that. But other states and regions are complaining that the Great Plains gets too much focus over this. So also economies of scale, which I'll show you in a second. FDR's sort of initial summary of the report, and then the committee goes into more specifics, talks about the problematic nature of living in the Great Plains and trying to produce here without having a sense of an economies of scale. And that scale has to include like the non-human parts, not just the soil and the health there, but also the importance of weather and climate and and basically what we call climate change today. Right? How do we secure this and produce on a scale that recognizes that? And it makes sense that they would have this sort of realization, yes, because of the dust storms and the drought that was just barraging the Great Plains during a national emergency of the Great Depression, right? So they are having these sort of recommendations. And then also the expansion of the USDA Yearbook of Ag, which you got to see, which merged in a lot of ways local knowledge with scientific expertise together, and imperfectly, but it did. And this is an idea of sort of public knowledge for a public good, right? And then there's council influence with those books, which are so dear to my heart for my collections, but also because they help shape early USDA policy in terms of disaster relief and the role the USDA plays. Now, I'm not saying it played a good role or a bad role necessarily, but the role that it played, right? Not putting necessarily value judgments on that. And then the role of extension science at land-grant colleges. One of the two most important land-grant colleges that helped drive all of this through the Truman and Eisenhower administrations and on, and especially help sort of create a foundation and a workspace in a lot of different ways for this Great Plains Agricultural Council is in Lincoln, University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And the other, guess what? Anyone have any ideas? Who would be the other main land grant?
Colorado State.
Colorado State. Christine for the win. Which, by the way, it's great to research there because it has great archives and because mountains. But council meetings, scientific studies, and test farms, all of that is sort of revealed in the council's work with land-grant colleges, not just sort of a space that they could do their work, but also the networks that expand from there. Here really quickly is this letter that I talked about, and we have to move on, but basically in there, and you can Google this later, the future of the Great Plains, the report of the Great Plains Committee. This is really the first time that they're sort of making these early recommendations about how to go forward with these economies of scale. And FDR is writing about how a new economy must be developed, which is based on the conservation and effective utilization of all water available, especially that which falls as rain and snow, an economy which represents generally a more rational adjustment of the organization of agriculture and cropping plans and methods of to natural conditions. It sort of expands that, talks about the role the committee can play and not just providing that for the region, but maybe in terms of helping shape a larger national approach. And again, remember, this is 1937, and it makes sense that they would sort of have come to these conclusions in a way, right? So this is how the council starts, really, and it continues. It continues through its role of these yearbooks of ag. It continues to have these annual meetings. That's perhaps the most important role it plays. It holds an annual meeting every once a year at least, sometimes less, more, but usually at least annually throughout the Great Plains. And everyone who shows up there can speak if they want to, have these ongoing conversations, at least from what I can say, and they come from all walks of life. Policymakers, folks who are very, very, very production-minded, folks who are very, very, very conservation, sort of environmental, what we say environmentalist-minded, the version of that. in the early or late 40s, early 50s. And then you have a lot of folks who are farmers or ranchers who are just like, yeah, I kind of like, obviously like I need to produce, but also like I care about my land more than just like its economic value. So I also want to know what I need to be doing to achieve that balance if we can. And so they're also there sharing that idea and those ideas and asking those questions. So what are some of the committees here? There's a disaster relief series of committees across the decades. The council is helping in planning systems of relief throughout the region. Too many to mention right now in different years and stuff. I'll track that more holistically in the book, of course. But that's interesting, right? And it lends itself, I think, to the connections of civil defense that I'm trying to look at that I think have traditionally played an undervalued role in the larger history of civil defense and Cold War history. Plains, weather, and climate research, climate studies, severe weather studies, and also what we call today climate change, 100%, right? Now, their big threat isn't climate change in and of itself, which I would argue is the threat today, right? When we talk about climate change, we're talking about what does that threat mean in and of itself. But guess what the main threat during the early Cold War era is? Communism. Right, so they're talking about what happens if climate change is doing this, or if we have these toxic accidents when we're using pesticides or whatever. What does that do to our larger production value and the health of our land, so that will that sort of undermine our efforts in this Cold War against the Soviet Union? Right, so the Soviet Union is the existential threat, not climate change in and of itself, but they're worried about it, and they're trying to figure out how to address it and how to learn from it, right? And I think that matters, especially in the times in which we live, right? That past can have a direct influence in how we talk about it, what we think about, and we can draw, maybe we can draw from this past to help us out. Soil stabilization, drought and soil health. Most of us know about the soil banks and soil conservation and the debates between Ezra Taft Benson and Eisenhower. By the way, they did not like each other. I'm learning that very much, especially his press secretary. Ike's press secretary did not like Benson at all. In his diaries, let me tell you. But drought and soil health matters, right? How they use soil, the science of it, some of the conservation efforts in the Eisenhower administration, for example. The council had to sort of litigate almost between Eisenhower presidential policy, federal policy of keeping certain lands restricted for conservation and others, but then with the droughts happening, can we use that land to produce on to maybe make up the difference of crop loss? And so that conversation, a lot of times council members are helping litigate that. Water resources, floods, irrigation issues, alternative agriculture later, but interestingly, not as late as you would expect. There's an idea about wildlife protection. There's ideas about and debates about environmental conservation and alternative energy, right, before 1970s, but especially after. Some of the civil defense and rural disaster relief connections, early ideas about food security. Presidents Truman and Eisenhower used this region as a template in a lot of ways, at least I'm arguing this, to expand this idea of emergency federalism and policies, especially around disaster relief and how to think about it for other parts of the country. So the Great Plains, I argue at least, is central there. And then Great Plains extension science continues while in a disaster or in direct response to it. And then basically the Great Plains Agricultural Council is being directly consulted in a lot of ways for national rural disaster relief standards. So all that to say, civil defense and the council are much more intertwined than I knew before I got into the archives at Truman and Eisenhower. So we get to go to Independence very quickly, Missouri, where the Truman Library is. Here's Truman. I finally got to the museum side after almost a week of research, so I thought I needed to do that, and it was great. You should go. Conservation Floods and Truman's Water Resources Policy Commission. You have everything in there from the executive order for this policy commission. And what Truman is doing here is that addressing two main pieces. One is what to do with all the flooding issues in the Missouri River Valley, Mississippi River Valley, but also other types of floods in the Great Plains and the Midwest. So floods also don't recognize Midwest versus Great Plains arguments that humans like to have, apparently, right? Doesn't matter to the flood. But also trying to get a more systematic approach to water conservation across the American West. And it starts sort of in the Great Plains. Also, Truman didn't have much downtime before it had ongoing floods in different parts of the Midwest and Great Plains. Here are a couple photos that I got from the library from Kansas City, Kansas, and Manhattan, Kansas, flooding out in 1951. By 1952, Truman is setting down in Omaha to address this flooding issue. So he shows up and brings his commission to a different level in terms of disaster relief for the floods. This is just like a kernel of stuff that I found at the Truman around this and around the council's role in this. Very quickly, because of our time, Eisenhower should show up to Abilene and hang out in Manhattan. Let's see, Eisenhower's drought tour in 1956-57. Key because he had already, the election actually in 1952 was another drought. The drought played a role in that election. And you see that with the arguments around Truman trying to promote Adlai Stevenson, but also recognizing that someone from the Great Plains with Eisenhower who understands ag policy enough and responses enough for disasters, because, you know, like other things, World War II in that popularity, probably it's going to win. And so it's an interesting role that the drought plays, but ultimately Eisenhower has to deal with the 1952 drought in the Great Plains that doesn't really go away, but only exponentially gets worse by 56 and 57. And again, scientists, farmers, ranchers, almost everyone involved with the council, they're all super worried that this is basically another Dust Bowl, right? And so he takes a drought tour out here. I couldn't get the Secret Service files about where he went, but there was enough sort of details about which farms and which kids talked to him and all that I feel like I got. But I was trying to get the Secret Service reports, but they wouldn't let me. It would take too long. I didn't want to go through that process. Also, they wouldn't let me. But this is interesting. So part of this drought tour report, the final reports, right? They're literally comparing the 1930s and wind erosion and drought and all of that with the 1950s. So there's just with wind erosion, but there are other maps in this booklet that I'm sharing today that do the same thing with other categories of drought disaster of the 30s and the 50s. Also, which is really fascinating, that council is front and center, but you really see with the Eisenhower administration, this emergency federalism of overlapping influence and guidance between the feds, the state, and local groups. And this is just an example here, sort of interagency relationships. But it really speaks, I think, from what I can tell in the evidence, it really speaks to sort of Eisenhower's emergency federalism approach. Again, imperfectly, I'm sure, but just how this sort of plays out between the feds, the state, and the local. And you sort of see this emerging federalism approach that in some ways is still around today. Also sort of overlapping the 30s with the 50s in these different basins. So again, you can look at it from the STEM side, you can look at it from the humanities side, but there's no doubt that in every which way, the 1930s is directly shaping the memories of that, the direct influence that people may have like experienced in that, definitely having a powerful effect in what this council and what the mitigation strategies are in the 1950s, no doubt about it. And I think for us and for me, that really matters because that's the role of history plays in sort of a history of science way, but also in a regional way, right? How people remember things matters in terms of how they perceive, especially in this type of scenario. Also, a lot of talk about climatic shifts and changes and the climatic zones in the Great Plains and how this council and other groups what they can do about it and why that matters, not just immediately, but in the future. Some of the scientists on the drought tour that joined Eisenhower checking out soil and sort of showing him directly the effects here. And this is one of my favorite. And I finally, actually, interestingly, right, I could not find, so I got too excited. Okay, so going back, Wichita, Kansas, he ends his drought tour in Wichita and speaks in the airplane hangar and sort of like talks to everyone who wanted to join him, scientists, people who just want to see Eisenhower, and kind of went through what they need to do next. And this is a really important document that I found at the Eisenhower because this is addressed to one of the main agricultural scientists involved with the council. So there's direct council relationship here that is informing the president about how sort of a disaster relief system should go forward, not just maybe for the Great Plains, but something larger. But also, I wanted to know, like, oh, wouldn't it be awesome to get like the actual remarks that I gave in the hangar here, right? And I'm like, oh, I can't find it. And surprisingly, because everything is like triplicate published in the Eisenhower records. Like, by the way, he did more than just golf, just saying. But there's so just a volume of stuff, but I couldn't find this one document. And then I was in the Truman Library, and somehow that got sent to the Truman archives. I don't know how, but it was like probably because Truman wanted to see what Eisenhower said, maybe. But I got the original remarks, and so I couldn't include it here. But anyway, that was great to find finally. And to start to conclude here, I also got really excited to start to go through a lot of newspapers around this time. So the council stuff in the news, and I like this in particular because even though this is a piece published in Kentucky, they are paying attention very much about what the council is doing, and that's true in other parts of the country and what's going on in the Great Plains. And for anyone who wanted to know where the West begins, according to this guy who wrote for the Messenger Inquirer, it begins in Kearney, Nebraska. And he goes on to talk about, and I'm going to use this like every single time, like even when I'm at history conferences, I'm going to say, like, oh, you want to have a debate of where the West begins? Look at this. Because that's another annoying debate that we all historians have. I don't know why we feel like we need to keep having it, but whatever. That's also for after the talk here. But this gets into talking about the specifics of the drought and the ongoing worries and what role the council is playing, and talks about sort of what it's like to visit here, which is that it's great, but it's not that great. The editorial guy didn't really like Kearney that much. Sort of did, but not that much. I'm like, didn't stay here long enough, I guess. But also, you have a really important piece that talks about climate change and adapting use. And use in this context is agricultural production, more or less, to climate, and cites the Great Plains, a recent council meeting as and what they talked about in terms of maybe a way forward for places in the Great Plains and further west. And then also you have a lot of pieces that sort of debate what is best to try to mitigate drought. In the Kearney Hub, you have people saying, oh, drought is way too hard for science, so we need to sort of focus in on our local knowledge. And sometimes local knowledge doesn't necessarily match up with reality, but they feel like it does. And so they have these debates, and I think that also matters because local knowledge can be fraught with a variety of ideas, and it still has power to shape where things go. So, to conclude, some of the takeaways from this project thus far. I think building networks matter for our precarious food future. I think we have a precarious food future. It's not a secure one. And that's from everything I've read so far and learned in history. But you could also look at the news right now and say, kind of precarious, right? So what can this study help us think about? I hope it helps us at least, which is that like during the Cold War era, the 21st century Great Plains is ground zero region for both our national and global food future. And if it's precarious, then the precarious things here also contribute to the precarious nature there. Number two, the importance of looking across political lines, views, and policy efforts. That's everywhere in the research that I'm looking at, right? Democrats, Republicans, people who don't really give a crap about that stuff, all of it is like important, and is playing out in these documents, right? And at some point, politics can make a food security insecure, right? And so that's all being debated and hashed out in this early Cold War era that I can see in the documents. If changing climates, environments, and production lands are intertwined, which I think they are, then interdisciplinary networks and approaches will be needed to address future risks to agriculture and securing natural resources such as water and soil. And I think this history can help us see that more clearly, those intertwined networks. Histories then of groups such as the Great Plains Agricultural Council can reveal historical relationships between Great Plains environments and agriculture and offer perspectives about current collaborations to address current hazards and risks. And then ultimately, I think it tells us unconventional partnerships are needed for these risks ahead. Thank you. And we have 5 minutes for questions. Questions? Yes.
Why did the Agricultural Council disband in 1990?
Well,
Might be outside your research.
yeah, I mean, I have some idea as to why. I haven't found the document that says like we're disbanding because we're mad or we don't get along, or I don't have any of that. What I think is the case is that by the late 80s and into the early 90s, you have 2 things happening. One is sort of much more established specific institutes of things. So like Drought Mitigation Center, right? So the council's role is lessened when you have entities like at Colorado State or Lincoln or other places where it's much more specific to the issue at hand or the specific disaster. I think that so you sort of see that starting to grow in a way that the council becomes less relevant at that point. Although as a historian, I'm like, I don't know, like they're really debating and arguing like year after year after year. And it's from a whole bunch of different places, walks of life. That's kind of an important space. I would personally think we kind of need more of those spaces again. But I think that's one of the reasons. The other reason is just funding and the larger model of agricultural extension science to be more privatized and less public. And so, you know, I mean, there are a lot of different reasons why that occurs in the 1980s, by the 1980s and in the early 1990s. But you have much more sort of privatization of that science in a way. So crop science, you can get your own sort of experts that you pay for their expertise, and it's much more specific in that way. And so I think that also starts to cut in with in terms of the council's, in terms of rationale why we should fund this entity when we have all these other entities. But that's just sort of what I found, generally speaking, from the documents in the 1990s. I don't necessarily have like a conclusive, here's why they like stopped. Yeah.
So one of the things you didn't talk about were the impacts that we have now with international markets. Did you see anything about considering international markets as part of the planning and the risk assessments that you saw?
I would have to go, I mean, a little bit. It's more about how do we produce to use agriculture as a weapon, sort of food as a weapon against the Soviet Union. So it's less about, I mean, I'm sure it's in there, but, and I haven't gotten to like post, like 1970s on, where that would become much more of a conversation piece, I would assume. So I haven't gotten to that piece yet in my research to have a conclusive answer for you, Julie, but I would imagine that they're talking more about producing on a scale to fight against communism. And so food becomes, an abundance of food becomes sort of the main goal. And how do we replicate that in different parts of the world? And ultimately that becomes sort of a, like Borlaug and the Green Revolution becomes sort of the full-throated version of that, right? Like we want to give other countries an opportunity to produce and have an abundance of food. And that abundance is an American idea. And it fights against communism. So that's much more what they're sort of talking about without actually like explicitly saying in the archives, in the archival materials. But I imagine that more and more part of food security is market, security and what that all means. So I'd imagine I'm going to see more council members talking more about that, but I haven't found that as much yet. But we have one more minute. Roger Davis for the last question.
I'm curious about concerns over the extension of federal authority at a time when clearly in the Soviet Union and that whole system, there were red flags about all that, particularly in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Do we see those concerns?
Yeah, they're more along the lines of sort of what you still hear today. Like, I don't want the federal government in my life, but we kind of need their help with the science piece or funding this piece. Or you see that a lot with the soil bank debates, where like, why does Eisenhower get to tell me if I can use this part of my land or not? And even within the council, you see debates about, like really it's on farmers and people who live on their fields. They need to take better care of their fields. They need to have a better sense, because if they don't, then we're going to have a federal dude coming in and telling us what to do. They don't use the word dude, but that was me. But it is, so you see that tension there. But there is more of a, and I think, and Eisenhower more than Truman in a way, there is more of a sort of middle, Eisenhower's pursuing sort of a middle way, in my opinion, that like we want to make sure that we have local and regional input and not just have a heavy-handed federalism. And maybe I'm sure people will dispute me in that, but that's what I've seen so far and what I've found. Now Benson, for example, Ezra Taft Benson, Secretary of Agriculture, and Eisenhower gets really mad that Eisenhower's like, we still need to like promote a soil bank system, and he wants to just like do what Butts would ultimately do, which is produce fentanyl to fentanyl. And there's this amazing moment where Eisenhower in a cabinet meeting minutes, right, which is fun to read for a lot of reasons, but Eisenhower like literally says, basically, Benson, I understand where you're coming from, but I don't think we can tell farmers that the federal government just doesn't want to help them anymore, right? Like, that's not going to play well, because he's just like, we'll just like step completely away. I mean, that was the exchange. So he's like, I have sympathy for your political position, but reality says, basically, is what he's suggesting there. So that was interesting, but those tensions are definitely present. So thank you, everybody, very much.